Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to a major transition point in my Essential Issues retrospective DC Comics series, where I talk about my favorite DC comics of the past that are still affordably available today, blabbing about why they are special to me and what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Warning, this series does freely contain spoilers, but I think even spoiled, the stories I feature are still well worth reading. This installment is going to be a bit different. Having finished our look at Infinite Crisis last time, we're now actually going to take what may feel like a surprising leap forward in the DC Comics publishing timeline. And right now, as we do that, I'm going to give an overview of an enjoyable yet somewhat forgettable period in my history as a DC Comics fan. There were definitely DC comic books that I remember enjoying immensely after Infinite Crisis, even if I've forgotten most details of the stories themselves. Although first I want to mention an important story that I didn't like and recommend an alternative to it. Not long after Infinite Crisis, Bruce Wayne's son Damian Wayne was introduced both to Bruce and to readers for the first time. At the time, I hated the idea of Bruce having a son and tried to just ignore Damian's existence and just remove him from my headcanon if at all possible. Surrogate family for Bruce was fine, but having real family risks taking something from Batman as the forever lonely and forever tragic hero that I really want him to remain. Now, years later, as my boys got a little older, I gained an appreciation for Damian in the New 52 era of DC Comics, but the way his origin story is told in the comics felt confusing and strangely rushed to me. So ironically, I'd recommend the animated movie adaptation of that story instead, titled Son of Batman, which made much better sense and had better flow to it as far as my sensibilities are concerned. It's a solid intro to the character and is all you need, I think, to enjoy the comic stories involving Damian Wayne. And as I'll probably mention later on in this series, I think some of those stories with Bruce and Damian are really worth reading as they explore, in admittedly uncommon and, frankly unrealistic circumstances, some very common heart issues that both parents and children have to navigate. Anyway, after Infinite Crisis were a handful of years where DC Comics felt really solid to me. Yet in hindsight, it was also past the peak of my comic reading enjoyment. The year-long weekly series 52 was such an impressive accomplishment to me, presenting an interesting mystery while also getting me acquainted with and interested in a variety of second and third tier DC characters, while Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman dropped off the radar. The weekly title also wonderfully leveraged the unique strength of comic books as an ongoing, almost live form of storytelling that was exciting to follow in quote-unquote real time as it published week to week. But after 52, in a seeming attempt to try and recapture lightning in a bottle, was the forgettable weekly series Countdown, which was also a weekly series that lasted a year and led into what I thought was the confusing and uninteresting crossover event Final Crisis, which was way overblown and very skippable, in my opinion. Also, very skippable is my reaction to that story years ago on the Spirit Blade Underground podcast, which was also overblown and I really regret, as I've said several times looking back on it since then. Final Crisis did have some worthwhile crossover tie-ins for my money, which in many ways function without needing to read the core Final Crisis story. Among those, for me, were Final Crisis Rogue's Revenge, featuring the famous Flash villains, and Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds, which featured the return of Superboy Prime. I'm not a big fan of the Legion of Superheroes, but I was really interested in seeing more of Superboy Prime. I believe it was written by Jeff Johns, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, I do like to have my finger on the pulse now and then of the Legion of Superheroes, just for the sake of familiarity with the DC universe as a whole, and so that was kind of a nice touch point for me, in addition to other things that I enjoyed. Neither of those crossover, tie-ins to Final Crisis are especially memorable to me now, but I at least remember enjoying them at the time. Blackest Night was a dark, character-driven horror crossover event story of sorts, giving a tour of the DC universe, and in particular, those who have died and managed to stay dead in the DC universe. The story brought many of the departed back as intelligent yet sadistic versions of themselves, animating rotting zombie-like bodies. But the follow-up event, Brightest Day, I remember almost nothing about, and neither event series left earth-shattering status quo changes to the DC universe as far as I can remember, so nothing I'd consider essential reading. Really, the next massive change to DCU continuity happened as a result of a story that I originally thought would be included in my Essential Issues series. That story is Flashpoint. Flashpoint, I think, is a solid story. It centers on Barry Allen, the Flash, who attempts to go back in time to save the life of his mother, who was murdered when he was very young, resulting in his father being wrongfully sentenced for her murder. But much of the story is essentially sort of like an Elseworlds tale, since Barry ends up radically changing history. A number of crossovers explore this alternate DC universe before Barry eventually sets things right again. Or does he? In the final panels of the story, we see the Flash talking to Batman, but he and Batman as well are both wearing noticeably different costumes. Subtly different, but noticeably different, with no explanation or recognition of this fact. It's one hint among others that Barry did not successfully return continuity completely back to normal, but instead left us in some kind of altered DC universe, what DC Publishing branded the New 52. It was a strange choice at the time, given that this was the most mammoth continuity reset since Crisis on Infinite Earths, and yet it happens almost as a footnote to a largely unrelated story. Now, if memory serves, Flashpoint, after it had already been mostly written, was basically leveraged by DC editorial to explain this massive continuity reset, which was done very much to try and reinvigorate readership and more easily onboard potential new readers. But Flashpoint was apparently not conceptualized for this purpose, just used to serve it almost after the fact. And you can start reading the New 52 era without any knowledge of the Flashpoint story and be just fine. In fact, in the Rebirth storyline years later, we learn that Barry isn't actually to blame for the New 52 reset, but that's a story for another time. Now, I have to admit, I was fairly open to the idea of the New 52 as they promoted it in the lead-up, but I actually wanted something a little more extreme, something more like a complete reboot, rather than the confusing soft reboot the New 52 actually was. But the larger problem for me by far was the nature of the broad sweeping changes to the DC universe. In certain comics, there seemed to be editorially driven demographic box checking to the point of pushing aside old characters or their original backstories and giving less time to telling the kind of character-driven stories I liked. Meanwhile, Batman seemed to be leaning into his surrogate family more, giving a first impression, to me at least, of him being way more happy and emotionally healthy than I want Batman to be. And Superman, by ironic contrast, had lost his marriage via the reset, like all other married heroes seemed to as well, and was now portrayed as an angry, brooding, and even sometimes creepy character. He was a dangerous Man of Steel that seemed to have anger issues. And when Superman becomes someone I wouldn't feel comfortable having my kids around, if he were to exist in the real world, I think then you've lost something essential to who Superman is. Finally, a much broader change across the DC universe was the seemingly systematic elimination of any senior citizens worth looking up to. Clark Kent's parents had now died in a car accident during his senior year of high school. And the Justice Society, the DC Universe's first generation of superheroes, was replaced by wildly alternate versions who were in their 20s, and conceptually the same almost only in name. I'm 44 now and was in my mid-30s when these changes were being made. Maybe they thought readers my age and younger at the time wouldn't care about this missing generation, but I loved the respect for legacy that DC had leveraged in the years leading up to the New 52. I thought it was valuable and important for even heroes like Superman to have older and wiser people to look up to and get wise counsel from. In fact, from a Christian perspective, seeking counsel from those older and wiser than us is a very biblical principle and part of the way that God intends for community to function. So on multiple levels, it was sad to see DC seemingly join the CW in terms of some of its values and priorities. Over the course of about 2 years, from 2011 to sometime I think in 2013, I read less and less of DC Comics each month until finally dropping my last monthly book. Then, almost 10 years after the launch of the New 52, as some of you already know, I reviewed the DC Universe Infinite service, which provided a way for me to give the New 52 era of DC another try with very little financial investment, very little financial risk. That was back in early 2021. And now, a year and a half later, I am a regular DC Comics reader again. I'm more excited about DC Comics than I've been since maybe even before Infinite Crisis. I don't know. I'm still catching up to DC's current publishing schedule. In fact, I've got a long way to go still. If you're interested and didn't know this, I've been chronicling my experience pretty much every week on the Christian Geek Central podcast in the Geek Week segment of the podcast, and am now emerging in my reading from the New 52 era into DC's follow-up sort of course correction initiative titled DC Universe Rebirth. But I've gained enough perspective now, I think, to go back and start sharing with you guys the material I've found to be essential reading during the New 52 period. Certainly, some of the stuff I disliked back then, I disliked again when I came back to it, but other things surprised me in a great way coming back to them or trying them for the first time that I just didn't have money to risk on back in the day. And those are the stories I'll begin sharing with you next time using a new and I think more focused format that I hope you guys will like. So I hope you join me each month as my Essential Issues series continues, now exploring what I consider to be the essential issues of DC's New 52. Summer insanity.
Liberate butter. Butter,